Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the wonderfully strange, surprisingly quiet world of an emperor who tried to ban laughter. Imagine, for a moment, that you're strolling through the bustling forum of ancient Rome, the sun beating down, the scent of roasting sausages mingling with the faint smell of humanity and something vaguely equine. You hear the clatter of carts, the murmur of senators, the shouts of vendors, but something is off. The usual joyful peals of children, the raucous guffaws from the taverns, the conspiratorial giggles among friends. They're all muted, perhaps even absent. Instead, you hear only hushed conversations, a nervous cough here and there, and the occasional, almost furtive, smile quickly suppressed. You glance at a passing legionary, his face grim, and then at a group of merchants, their expressions neutral, almost fearful. Welcome, my friends, to a Rome under the reign of Elagabalus, where even a chuckle could be problematic. You probably won't survive this level of enforced solemnity, even if you're trying to catch some Z single quotes S. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're drifting off, maybe drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported, not to the heart of Rome just yet, but to the sun-drenched, incense-filled city of Emesa, in what is now modern-day Syria. The year is around 203 AD, and the air here is thick with the scent of myrrh and frankincense, not just the usual Roman street smells. You're standing, perhaps, near the magnificent temple of Elagabalus, a colossal structure dedicated to the local sun god, also known as Elagabalus. This isn't your typical Roman deity with a stern face and a toga. Oh no, this god is worshipped in the form of a massive, conical black stone, said to have fallen from the heavens. It's a meteorite, if you want the modern term, and it's revered with an almost feverish devotion. You see priests, clad in silken robes, moving with a solemn rhythmic grace. Among them, even as a young boy, stands our protagonist. His name is Varius Avitus Bassianus, though you'll soon know him by another far more infamous moniker. He's a high priest of this very cult, a role that runs in his family. His grandmother, Julia Misa, and his mother, Julia Soenius, are formidable women, part of the powerful Severan dynasty that currently rules Rome. You might think of them as the ultimate stage mothers, but with empire-level stakes. From a very, very young age, this boy is steeped in ritual, in the elaborate ceremonies of the sun god. He's accustomed to pomp, to grandeur, to being at the center of attention. Imagine a child whose entire upbringing revolves around leading thousands in devotion to a rock from space. It certainly sets a unique trajectory for life, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether his devotion was genuine or merely a political tool. Was he truly captivated by the sun god, or was he just a very good actor, playing the part he was given? You can almost smell the exotic perfumes and hear the chanting from the temple as you observe his early life, a life far removed from the marble halls of Rome, yet destined to collide with them in the most spectacular fashion. This boy, born to an ancient Eastern priestly lineage, is about to become an emperor of the Roman world, bringing his strange gods and even stranger habits with him. The stage is set for a truly unusual reign, one where the divine and the deeply peculiar would intertwine. You can almost feel the desert wind on your face, carrying whispers of a destiny no one could have predicted. You continue to observe the young Varius Avitus Bassianus in Emesa, still very much a boy, but already possessing an aura of something different. His family, particularly his grandmother, Julia Misa, understands the precarious nature of power in the Roman Empire. Emperors, even powerful ones, rarely die peacefully in their beds. Intrigue, assassination, and military coups are as common as a bad toga day in Rome. And at this moment, the current emperor, Caracalla, is a cousin, but also a volatile, paranoid ruler. Misa, a woman of sharp intellect and even sharper ambition, sees an opportunity, a way to secure her family's position, and perhaps even elevate them to the very top. You can almost hear the gears turning in her mind, a quiet click of ambition far louder than any temple chant. The key to her plan lies with this young priest, her grandson. He's handsome, charismatic, and crucially, he serves a powerful, exotic god. In a Roman world, always looking for new deities and spiritual experiences, a high priest of a powerful Eastern sun god could be very appealing, especially to the legions stationed in the East. These soldiers, often far from Rome and more exposed to Eastern customs, might find a connection to this unusual figure. Misa begins to weave her web, a delicate but determined dance of propaganda and strategic alliances. She spreads rumors, whispers of a divine connection between her grandson and the recently assassinated Caracalla. She claims, quite audaciously, that Varius Alvitus Pacienus is Caracalla's illegitimate son, a claim that would give him a direct, albeit scandalous, link to the imperial line. You can almost see her, moving through the military camps, dropping hints, observing reactions, always with an eye on the bigger prize. This isn't just idle gossip. It's a carefully crafted political campaign. She leverages her immense wealth, her influence, and the devotion surrounding the god Elagabal. Imagine the scene. A stern-faced legionary, hardened by years of campaigning, listens intently as a woman of immense gravitas speaks of divine omens and a rightful heir. It's a potent mix. The soldiers, perhaps tired of the current, increasingly unpopular Emperor Macrinus, who seized power after Caracalla's death, are looking for a new leader, a rallying cry. And here, in Emesa, is a young man, a priest, who seems to offer just that. He's presented as a beacon of hope, a link to a more legitimate past. Historians still argue whether the soldiers genuinely believed the paternity claim or simply used it as a convenient excuse to revolt. Were they truly swayed by divine right, or just by the promise of change and perhaps a generous bonus? You might even imagine the faint scent of stale wine and unwashed tunics in the air as these soldiers weigh their options, their future, and the future of Rome. On the words of a cunning grandmother, the narrative crafted by Misa gains traction. The idea of a young, divinely favored emperor, connected to the popular Caracalla, begins to spread like wildfire through the legions. You can almost feel the anticipation building, the low hum of conspiracy taking root. The stage is being set for an uprising, one that will propel a priest of the sun god from a provincial temple to the very pinnacle of Roman power. You can sense the quiet determination in Mesa's eyes, the carefully managed fervor among the troops, all converging on a single, audacious goal: to place her grandson on the imperial throne. It's a masterclass in ancient political maneuvering, proving that sometimes all you need is a good story, a bit of strategic propaganda, and a very large black rock. And perhaps a few whispers about how the current emperor just isn't living up to expectations. The whispers and rumors cultivated by Julia Misa finally blossom into open rebellion. You find yourself amidst the legionaries, the dust of the Syrian desert clinging to your sandals, the air thick with anticipation and the metallic tang of unwashed armor. It's the spring of 218 at the Emperor Macrinus, who ascended to the throne after Caracalla's assassination, has proven unpopular. He's seen as an outsider, a commoner, and perhaps more importantly, he's been stingy with the traditional donatives, the generous handouts of cash that new emperors usually bestow upon the troops. In the Roman Empire, a tight purse often leads to a loose grip on power. and Macrinus's reluctance to share the spoils has cost him dearly. Misa, ever the astute strategist, plays on these grievances. She presents her grandson, Varius Avicius Passienus, now being referred to by his divine title, Elagabalus, as the true heir, the legitimate son of the beloved, or at least less disliked, Caracalla. You can almost hear her impassioned speeches, delivered in the flickering light of campfires, painting a picture of a glorious past and a divinely sanctioned future under this young, enigmatic priest. She promises wealth, stability, and a return to the good old days. And the soldiers, ever pragmatic, are listening. On May 16th, 218 AD, the moment arrives. In a bold move, Misa smuggles Elagabalus, still a mere 14-year-old, into the camp of the Legio III Gallica, a powerful legion stationed near Emesa. Imagine the scene. A nervous, yet undoubtedly thrilled, teenager being presented to thousands of armed, battle-hardened men. You can feel the tension in the air, the collective holding of breath. Then, a roar erupts. The soldiers, swayed by Misa's promises, and perhaps a substantial bribe, historians still argue about the exact amounts involved. But you can bet it wasn't chump change, declare Emperor. The shouts of Imperator echo through the camp, a sound that promises both glory and grave danger. This isn't just a spontaneous outburst. It's a meticulously orchestrated coup. The Legio III Gallica, fueled by their new loyalty, marches on Antioch, a major city in the region, where Macrinus and his own son, Diademenian, are based. You can almost see the dust cloud rising from the marching legions, a clear sign of impending conflict. Macrinus, realizing the severity of the rebellion, attempts to rally his forces, but his support is dwindling, and his troops are demoralized. The story of the young, divine emperor from Emesa has captivated the imagination of many. You find yourself on the battlefield, near Antioch, as the two forces clash. It's not a prolonged, epic battle. Macrinus's forces are half-hearted, their loyalty wavering. Many desert him, flocking to the banner of Elagabalus. The turning point comes swiftly. Macrinus attempts to flee, disguised as a civilian, but he is captured and executed shortly after. His young son Diademenian suffers the same fate. And just like that, with a brief, decisive military engagement, the high priest of Emesa, the young Varius Avicius Passienus, is now the undisputed emperor of Rome. You witness the jubilation among the victorious troops, the raising of standards, the shouts of victory. A new era, a truly peculiar one, has begun for the vast Roman Empire, all orchestrated by a grandmother with an unwavering vision and a very persuasive narrative. You can almost hear the cheers fading into the distance, leaving behind the quiet realization that the boy who worshipped the black stone is now master of the known world. With Macrinus swiftly dispatched, the path to Rome lay open for the young. Elagabalus, you find yourself among his retinue, a grand procession slowly making its way from the dusty east towards the heart of the empire. This isn't a quick jaunt. It's a journey that takes nearly a year. Imagine the logistics. A vast entourage, thousands of soldiers, servants, priests, and all the paraphernalia of an imperial court, traversing ancient roads, crossing rivers, and winding through mountain passes. You can almost feel the rhythmic sway of the imperial carriage, the distant clamor of marching feet, and the changing sense of the land as you move from the arid Levant to the more verdant landscapes of Anatolia, and then across the Adriatic into Italy. This extended journey isn't just about travel. It's a strategic move. Elagabalus, or rather, his handlers chief, among them his grandmother Julia Misa and his mother Julia Soenias, used this time to consolidate power and establish his legitimacy. Letters are dispatched to the Senate in Rome, announcing the new emperor and justifying his ascension. You can almost picture the senators, gathered in their marble halls, reading these proclamations with a mixture of apprehension and forced acceptance. They knew the Severan family, for better or worse, and now a new branch of it, seemingly even stranger, was taking the reins. But the journey is also a spectacle, an opportunity for the new emperor to present himself to his vast domain. Elagabalus, still only a teenager, makes a striking impression wherever he goes. He's not dressing in the traditional Roman fashion. Instead, he favors elaborate, flowing Eastern robes, often made of silk and adorned with jewels. His hair is styled in an unusual way, and he sports a distinctive priestly coiffure. And most notably, he travels with his beloved black stone, the sacred meteorite of Elagabal, prominently displayed. Imagine the stares of the provincial townspeople as this flamboyant, exotic young man, accompanied by a giant black rock, rolls into their quiet settlements. You might even hear a child whisper, "Mama, what's that big stone?" and a parent shush them quickly. This unorthodox presentation is deliberate. It's meant to signal a new order, a break from tradition. However, it also raises eyebrows. Roman society, while generally open to foreign gods and customs, still had a strong sense of its own identity and propriety. This young emperor, with his Eastern attire and his conspicuous devotion to a foreign cult, is already setting himself apart in ways that will make many Romans uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether this was a calculated move to challenge Roman norms or simply the authentic expression of a deeply religious young man who genuinely believed in his sun god. Was he trying to shock, or was he merely being himself, oblivious to the social tremors he was causing? You can almost feel the gentle hum of rumor and speculation spreading ahead of the imperial procession, a whisper of the strange times to come. As the entourage finally draws near to Rome, the anticipation intensifies. You can imagine the preparations. In the capital, the triumphal arches being readied, the crowds gathering along the Via Flaminia, all eager to catch a glimpse of their new ruler. They've heard the stories, the rumors, and now they will see for themselves. The air is electric, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This isn't just another emperor. This is Elagabalus, the priest king from the east, bringing his god, his rituals, and his entirely unconventional ways to the heart of the Roman world. You can almost taste the dust of the road giving way to the promise of marble and glory, or perhaps, just maybe, utter chaos. The grand procession finally reaches Rome, and you are swept along with the throngs of onlookers, eager to witness the arrival of their new emperor. The traditional triumphal arch stands ready, festooned with garlands. The streets are packed, the air buzzing with a mixture of anticipation and perhaps a touch of trepidation. As the imperial entourage enters, you notice a palpable shift in the atmosphere. This isn't the usual grand military parade Rome is accustomed to. This is something entirely different. Elagabalus, still a teenager, makes his entrance not in the traditional military garb of a Roman emperor, but in the exotic flowing robes of an Eastern priest. His face is heavily made up, and he wears an elaborate diadem, quite unlike the laurel wreaths of past emperors. But what truly captures everyone's attention is not the young man himself, but what accompanies him. Carried on a chariot, adorned with gold and jewels, is the black stone of Elagabal, the sacred meteorite from Amasia. Imagine the collective gasp, quickly suppressed, as this dark, conical rock, not a statue of Jupiter or Mars, is paraded through the heart of Rome. You might even hear a child ask, "Is that a giant pebble?" before being shushed by a mortified parent. This isn't just an entrance. It's a declaration. Elagabalus, or more accurately, his powerful female relatives, are making it clear. The cult of Elagabal is not just being introduced to Rome. It is being placed at the very pinnacle of Roman religion. The young emperor immediately sets about, building a magnificent new temple on the Palatine Hill, dedicated to his sun god. This isn't just any temple. It's designed to overshadow all others, including the venerable temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline. Imagine the outrage among the traditional Roman senators and priests, who for centuries had worshipped their pantheon of gods. Their religious order, their very worldview, was being challenged by a teenage foreign priest and his sacred rock. Elagabalus takes on the title Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, a role traditionally held by the emperor, but he uses it to elevate Elagabal above all other Roman deities. Sacrifices are performed daily, not in the familiar Roman style, but with Eastern rituals that include dancing, drumming, and even, it is said, the sacrifice of exotic animals. You can almost smell the unfamiliar incense wafting through the city, mixing with the usual Roman odors of sewage and roasted meat. The city, accustomed to its own structured religious life, finds itself confronted with something alien and deeply unsettling. He attempts to bring other, less prominent gods into the orbit of Elagabal. He even tries to marry the goddess Minerva, one of Rome's most important deities, to his sun god. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine attempt at religious synthesis or a deliberate act of provocation designed to dismantle traditional Roman beliefs. Was he a zealous reformer or simply a boy pushing boundaries to see how far he could go? You might imagine a few older Roman women discreetly crossing themselves, or the Roman equivalent, and muttering about the audacity of this young man. This grand, audacious arrival signals the beginning of a reign that will be remembered not for its military victories or wise governance, but for its sheer, bewildering eccentricity. The Black Stone had arrived, and Rome would never be quite the same. You can feel the quiet unease rippling through the crowds, a sense that something profoundly odd has just begun. With the Black Stone of Elagabal firmly ensconced on the Palatine Hill, you might expect the young emperor to settle into more traditional Roman governance. But you'd be mistaken. Elagabalus, still only around 15 years old, had other, far more personal, ideas about imperial conduct, especially when it came to marriage and gender roles. He was about to shock Rome not just with his religious fervor, but with his utterly unconventional romantic life. You can almost hear the collective clatter of dropped scrolls in the Senate. His first major marital scandal involved his first wife, Julia Cornelia Paula. She was from a distinguished Roman family, a politically sensible match. But Elagabalus seemed to quickly tire of her. His attention soon turned to a Vestal virgin named Aquilia Severa. Now, if you know anything about Vestal virgins, you know this was a monumental scandal. These priestesses of Vesta were sworn to 30 years of chastity. Breaking that vow was considered sacrilege, punishable by being buried alive. Yet, Elagabalus, claiming it was a marriage holy and pure that would produce godlike children, forcibly married her. Imagine the horror, the whispered outrage among Roman society. You might even hear a Roman matron faint into her handmaid's arms. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine spiritual conviction, a profound disregard for Roman tradition, or simply a provocative act from a young man used to getting his way. Was he truly trying to blend Roman and Eastern religion, or just being a rebellious teenager on an imperial scale? But it didn't stop there. Elagabalus seemed to delight in pushing societal boundaries. He is famously said to have married a former slave, a charioteer named Heracles, treating him as a husband and calling himself Heracles' wife. You can almost see the incredulous expressions on the faces of rigid Roman aristocrats struggling to comprehend such a blatant disregard for established norms. He also took a male lover, Zodicus, an athlete, whom he appointed to high positions, showering him with lavish gifts. These relationships were not just private affairs. They were public spectacles, deeply unsettling to a Roman society that valued traditional masculinity and clear gender roles, even if private indiscretions were common. Furthermore, Elagabalus himself often adopted female attire and behavior. He would wear makeup, pluck his body hair, and even, it is said, offered vast sums to any doctor who could perform gender reassignment surgery. He preferred to be called mistress, not master, and sometimes donned the purple robes reserved for empresses. You might imagine a few centurions discreetly adjusting their helmets, trying to look anywhere but at their emperor. This was not merely eccentric fashion. It was a profound challenge to Roman notions of identity and imperial dignity. The reaction in Rome was one of profound shock and scandal. The Senate, already uneasy with his religious reforms, was utterly appalled by his personal conduct. The traditional Roman elite viewed these actions as not just un-Roman, but as a dangerous erosion of moral order. His grandmother, Julia Misa, who had orchestrated his rise, must have been tearing her hair out, trying to rein in her wildly unpredictable grandson. You can almost feel the stifling air of scandal, the whispered condemnations behind closed doors, as Rome grappled with an emperor who seemed determined to dismantle every social and gender convention in his path. This wasn't just about personal preference. It was seen as a direct assault on the very foundations of Roman society. Having utterly scandalized Rome with his bizarre marriages and gender fluidity, Elagabalus wasn't done reshaping the imperial image. You now find yourself invited or perhaps commanded to observe his daily routine. And let me tell you, it was anything but routine. Imagine stepping into the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, expecting solemnity and gravitas, only to be confronted with a kaleidoscope of peculiar habits and opulent excess that would make even the most jaded Roman raise an eyebrow. Our young emperor had a flair for the dramatic, and his personal life was his grandest stage. He reportedly wore clothes made entirely of silk, a scandalous luxury even for an emperor, and often adorned with jewels so heavy they must have been a literal pain in the neck. You might spot him changing his outfit multiple times a day, always, for something more elaborate, more dazzling, often blurring the lines between male and female attire. You can almost hear the rustle of expensive fabrics and the faint jingle of pearls as he drifts past. A human peacock in purple, his obsession, with luxury extended to his dining habits, which were legendary for their extravagance and oddity. Forget your average Roman feast. Elagabalus would serve dishes made from flamingo brains, parrot tongues, or even dormice stuffed with exotic spices. Imagine the perplexed look on a senator's face as he's presented with a platter of what looks suspiciously like tiny roasted rodents. He reportedly bathed in scented oils and wore cosmetics, which was highly unusual for a Roman man, especially an emperor. His attendants were often chosen for their physical beauty rather than their political acumen, leading to a court filled with pretty faces and perhaps less practical experience. Beyond the personal eccentricities, there was a constant desire to shock and amuse. He would host dinner parties where the guests would be served entirely fake food made of marble or wood. Or he'd release lions or leopards among the guests, ensuring a lively, if terrifying, evening. You might hear the terrified screams of a senator as a startled big cat pads too close to his chair, quickly followed by Elagabalus's delighted laughter. He was known for scattering gold dust in the circus arena instead of sand, and even throwing gold and silver coins from the palace windows to the crowds below, a gesture that was either incredibly generous or incredibly wasteful, depending on your perspective and how many coins you managed to catch. Historians still argue whether these actions were purely the impulsive whims of a spoiled teenager, a deliberate strategy to break down Roman norms, or perhaps even a form of performance art, a bizarre attempt to create a unique imperial identity. Was he genuinely trying to be provocative, or did he simply lack any filter between thought and action? You might find yourself quietly wondering if he ever just wanted a quiet night in with a good scroll and some normal porridge. His daily life wasn't just lavish. It was a constant, unsettling spectacle, keeping everyone on edge and confirming to many Romans that their new emperor was, to put it mildly, delightfully unhinged. You can almost feel the chaotic energy emanating from the imperial palace, a vibrant, unsettling hum that pervaded the very air of Rome. After unsettling the Roman elite with his exotic religion and scandalous personal life, Elagabalus decided it was time to address a far more fundamental aspect of Roman society, its sense of humor. You're now witnessing one of the most peculiar imperial decrees ever issued, an attempted ban on laughter. Imagine the scene, not a dramatic public announcement, but a quiet, insidious policy emerging from the marble halls of the Palatine. You might hear the faint whisper of it first, carried on the breeze. A strange rumor that quickly solidifies into unsettling reality. God, it wasn't a universal, explicit law that declared, "Thou shalt not laugh." That would have been too obvious, too easily defied. Instead, it was a more subtle, yet pervasive, form of suppression. Elagabalus, seemingly disturbed by the spontaneous, often raucous mirth of his subjects, began to implement policies that discouraged overt expressions of joy. Public performances, especially comedies and mimes that relied on broad humor, were curtailed or made significantly more solemn. Gatherings where merriment was traditionally expected, like banquets and festivals, became strangely muted affairs. You might attend a feast where the usual boisterous storytelling and jovial banter are replaced by hushed conversations and nervous glances. The emperor himself led by example, maintaining a rigid, almost severe demeanor in public, rarely seemed to genuinely smile, let alone laugh. His courtiers, eager to curry favor or simply to avoid his displeasure, quickly mimicked his solemnity. Imagine a group of imperial advisors, usually quick with a witty retort or a hearty chuckle, now conversing in hushed tones, their faces carefully neutral, as if constantly trying to look like they're solving a very difficult quadratic equation. You can almost feel the air thick with suppressed giggles, the uncomfortable silence hanging heavy. This wasn't about prohibiting happiness, but about controlling its outward expression, perhaps seeing laughter as a sign of disrespect or even a challenge to his divine authority. Why would an emperor try to ban laughter? Historians still argue about the motivations behind this peculiar decree. Was it a genuine belief that mirth was undignified or unbecoming of a society dedicated to his serious sun god? Was it a form of social control, an attempt to assert absolute power over even the most basic human emotions? Or perhaps, as some suggest, was it simply another manifestation of his profound immaturity and a bizarre desire to stand apart from every established norm? You might quietly wonder if he himself had simply never learned how to truly laugh. A sad thought for such a young ruler. The effect on Roman society was profound, albeit subtly so. The vibrant, boisterous character of the city, known for its public spectacles and lively street life, began to dim. The usual cheerful greetings became more muted, the shared jokes more guarded. People learned to keep their amusement to themselves, to smile inwardly rather than outwardly. You might witness a subtle twitch of a lip, quickly corrected, or a twinkle in an eye that vanishes the moment it's noticed. The joy wasn't gone, but it was forced underground, becoming a quiet act of defiance rather than a natural expression. This particular imperial whim added another layer to the already perplexing reign of Elagabalus, cementing his reputation as an emperor unlike any other, one who even dared to challenge the very sound of human happiness. You can almost feel the stifling weight of enforced solemnity, a silent pressure on the once lively Roman populace. Asterisk, the attempted suppression of laughter by Elagabalus, as you've observed, didn't manifest as a thunderous imperial decree, but rather as a chilling, pervasive chill that settled over Rome. You find yourself now among the general populace, trying to gauge their reaction. It's one thing for senators and courtiers to rein in their mirth. It's quite another for an entire city known for its vibrant street life to suddenly go quiet. Initially, there was probably confusion. Romans were, by nature, a pragmatic and often boisterous people. They enjoyed their jokes, their comedies, their public spectacles filled with ribald humor. The idea of an emperor discouraging laughter would have struck many as absurd, almost like trying to ban breathing. You might hear a market vendor, initially, attempt a quick joke with a customer, only for it to fall flat, met with a nervous cough instead of a chuckle. The air would be thick with unspoken amusement, with eyes darting around to see who might be watching. Then, as the implication of the emperor's preference became clearer, a more subtle form of resentment began to simmer. No one wants to be told they can't enjoy a good laugh. The humor didn't disappear, but it transformed. It became clandestine. Jokes were whispered behind cupped hands in the bustling tavernet, pubs, eyes twinkling conspiratorially. A shared glance across a crowded street could convey a world of unspoken amusement, a silent communion of defiance against the imperial solemnity. Imagine trying to explain to a modern stand-up comedian that their entire act was now forbidden. They'd probably try to find a way to make even silence hilarious. This pressure to suppress mirth added another layer of anxiety to daily life. People became more guarded, more cautious in their public interactions. The spontaneity that often characterized Roman public life began to erode, replaced by a cautious reserve. You might observe a group of friends walking together, their shoulders hunched, their expressions carefully neutral, even as something profoundly silly happens right before their eyes. The fear wasn't necessarily of direct punishment for laughing, though Elagabalus was known for his unpredictable cruelty, but of drawing unwanted attention, of being seen as disrespecting the emperor's peculiar sensibilities. Historians still argue whether this social shift was a genuine attempt at moral reform or simply a manifestation of Elagabalus's alienation from common Roman sensibilities. Was he truly so out of touch that he couldn't comprehend the importance of laughter, or was he deliberately trying to break the Roman spirit by targeting such a fundamental human expression? You might find yourself musing on the irony. An emperor, seeking divine connection, yet seemingly incapable of understanding the simple, human joy that binds people together. The collective suppression of laughter, though not as dramatic as a military revolt, was a subtle but profound act of cultural strangulation, adding to the growing catalog of reasons why Rome was increasingly uneasy with its young, unpredictable ruler. You can almost feel the quiet hum of unspoken defiance, a subtle vibration of rebellion in the heart of the city. Asterisk. The peculiar reign of Elagabalus, marked by his exotic religion and his attempts to curb laughter, naturally provoked strong reactions from the most traditional and powerful institution in Rome, the Senate. You are now privy to the hushed conversations and the barely concealed disdain that permeated the very air within the venerable Curia Hostilia. The senators, the guardians of Roman tradition, law, and morality, were utterly appalled. To them, Elagabalus was not just an eccentric. He was a profound insult to everything they held sacred. His blatant disregard for Roman religious practices, his promotion of a foreign sun god above Jupiter, and his outlandish personal life, especially his unconventional marriages and gender expression, were seen as a direct assault on the Mos Maiorum, the ancestral customs and traditions that formed the bedrock of Roman society. Imagine a group of stern, toga-clad men, their faces etched with disapproval, as they listened to reports of the emperor dressing in silk robes or marrying a Vestal virgin. You might even hear the faint thwack of a hand slapping a forehead in exasperation. Their disdain wasn't just personal, it was political. The Senate saw itself as the embodiment of Roman authority and legitimacy, even under an emperor. Elagabalus's actions systematically undermined their dignity and influence. He often bypassed them, made arbitrary appointments, and seemed to delight in shocking them. He once famously appointed a number of bizarre characters to high office, including a dancer, a charioteer, and a barber. Imagine the collective shudder of the patrician class as they discovered their esteemed institutions were being filled with such un-Roman figures. The senators, however, were shrewd. Open defiance was suicide. Instead, their resistance was subtle, born of a quiet, seething resentment. They might meticulously record his decrees, but with a barely perceptible sigh. They would fulfill their duties, but with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. They would feign respect in his presence, their faces carefully neutral, while their minds undoubtedly seethed with contempt and plotting. You can almost feel the icy politeness, the strained smiles, and the tension that crackled beneath the surface of every imperial meeting. Historians still argue whether the Senate's resistance was purely ideological or driven by a pragmatic desire to restore their own power and influence. Were they truly defending Roman values or just their own vested interests? This quiet opposition, however, was a significant problem for Elagabalus. An emperor needed the support, or at least the grudging cooperation, of the Senate to effectively govern. Without it, his reign would always be seen as illegitimate, lacking the moral authority that Rome's ancient institutions provided. The senators, despite their apparent powerlessness, held immense social and political weight. Their collective disapproval, whispered through the city, corroded Elagabalus's authority day by day. You can almost picture them retreating to their grand villas after a particularly infuriating day in the Curia, pouring themselves a glass of wine and muttering about the audacity of this boy emperor. The stage was set, not for an immediate clash, but for a slow, inexorable slide toward his eventual downfall, fueled by the quiet but powerful disdain of Rome's oldest elite. Beyond the daily scandals and the attempted suppression of laughter, Elagabalus's reign is perhaps best remembered for his truly extravagant and often absurd imperial feasts. You are now a privileged, or perhaps unfortunate, guest at one of these legendary banquets, held within the opulent, yet increasingly unsettling, confines of the Palatine Palace. Forget anything you thought you knew about Roman dining. This was a culinary and theatrical experience unlike any other. Imagine entering a vast dining hall, the air thick with the scent of exotic spices and unheard-of perfumes, not just the familiar garum fish sauce of everyday Roman cuisine. The tables groan under the weight of gold and silver platters, but it's not just the quantity that's astonishing. It's the sheer oddity of the fare. Elagabalus delighted in serving dishes that were rare, costly, and often simply bizarre. You might be presented with platters of flamingo tongues, nightingale brains, or even peacock heels. Imagine, politely, trying to chew on a flamingo tongue, all the while attempting to maintain a neutral expression, lest you betray any amusement or disgust. You might whisper to a fellow guest, "Is this what divine cuisine tastes like?" Only to be met with a nervous cough. But the oddity wasn't limited to the food itself. Elagabalus loved to play pranks on his guests. One famous anecdote recounts him serving guests food made entirely of marble, glass, or ivory, perfectly sculpted to resemble actual dishes, but utterly inedible. You can almost see a senator, fork poised, realizing with dawning horror that his roast boar is actually a solid piece of carved stone. Another favorite trick was to release wild animals, such as lions or leopards, among the unsuspecting diners. Of course, they were reportedly declawed and defanged, but imagine the sheer panic as a big cat saunters past your chair while you're mid-bite of a particularly strange dormouse. You might let out a small, involuntary shriek, quickly stifled by the emperor's delighted cackles. Historians still argue whether these pranks were genuinely malicious or simply the product of an overactive, childish imagination with unlimited resources. Was he trying to instill fear, or simply to amuse himself? The seating arrangements were often chaotic, deliberately subverting Roman social hierarchies. Slaves might be seated next to senators, and prostitutes alongside revered magistrates. This wasn't just social leveling. It was an active mockery of the strict Roman class system. The wine flowed freely, often scented with flowers, and guests might be showered with rose petals from the ceiling, sometimes in such quantities that people reportedly suffocated. You can almost feel the soft, fragrant petals descending, initially pleasant, then quickly becoming overwhelming. These feasts were more than just meals. They were elaborate performances designed to showcase Elagabalus's boundless wealth, his contempt for Roman norms, and his unique, often unsettling sense of humor. They were a constant source of gossip and scandal, confirming to many that their emperor was not merely unconventional, but perhaps profoundly unsuited to rule. You can almost taste a mixture of rich, exotic flavors and underlying tension. A truly unique dining experience that few would ever forget, even if they tried. You've just witnessed Elagabalus's shocking feasts, but his disregard for Roman tradition extended even to the most sacred of rituals. You now find yourself observing his attempts to integrate, or rather impose, the cult of Elagabal even further into the very fabric of Roman religious life, particularly through the realm of animal sacrifices. This wasn't just about sacrificing a few lambs. It was about reshaping the spiritual landscape of Rome in his God's image. Roman religion, while complex, had a generally understood system of animal sacrifice. Specific animals for specific gods, performed in specific ways. Elagabalus, however, introduced rituals that were decidedly and disturbingly un-Roman. He conducted daily sacrifices to the sun god Elagabal on the Palatine, sometimes involving hundreds of bulls and sheep. Imagine the constant bellowing of the animals, the thick smell of burning fat and incense mingling in the air, a scent that would have been a daily reminder of the foreign cult now dominating Rome's spiritual center. You might even hear the faint rhythmic drumming of Eastern instruments, a jarring contrast to the more melodic flutes usually accompanying Roman rites. But it was the nature of some of these sacrifices that truly unnerved the Romans. Accounts suggest that Elagabalus sometimes included exotic and unusual animals in his offerings, animals not traditionally associated with Roman deities. There are even whispers, though historians still debate their veracity, of more extreme, perhaps even human sacrifices, or at least a symbolic offering of young boys to the sun god. While probably exaggerated by later hostile writers, the very idea circulated, fueling Roman fears and disgust. Whether literal or metaphorical, the implication was that Elagabalus was willing to go to disturbing lengths for his deity. You might find yourself quietly wondering if that peculiar smell in the air is just burning incense. He also brought a more theatrical, almost ecstatic element to the sacrifices. He himself, clad in his elaborate silk robes, would dance and chant. During the rituals, a sight that would have been utterly alien to the staid, formal Roman priests. Roman religious ceremonies were serious, dignified affairs, not spontaneous displays of devotion. His open, zealous worship of the Black Stone was a constant affront to the traditional Roman pantheon and its devotees. Historians still argue whether his enthusiasm for these rituals was genuine spiritual fervor, or merely another performance designed to shock and awe. Was he truly a devout priest, or just a young man testing the limits of what an emperor could get away with? The purpose of these extravagant sacrifices, beyond mere religious devotion, was also symbolic. By making them a central, daily spectacle, Elagabalus was asserting the supremacy of his sun god over all other Roman deities. He even had statues of other Roman gods, including the revered Jupiter, brought into the temple of Elagabal, not as equals, but as attendants, seemingly bowing before the black stone. You can almost see the traditional priests wringing their hands, their faces pale with outrage, as their ancient gods were demoted to mere footnotes in the cult of Elagabal. This relentless assault on Roman religious sensibilities, enacted through these bizarre and often unsettling sacrifices, further alienated Elagabalus from the very people he ruled, cementing his image as a foreign, incomprehensible tyrant. Having imposed his bizarre religious practices and scandalous social behavior on Rome, Elagabalus turned his attention to his living quarters, specifically the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. You are now being granted a rare, unsettling glimpse into the emperor's private domain, where his eccentricities truly ran wild. This wasn't just a home. It was a stage for his constant, bewildering theatrics. The Palatine, already a sprawling complex of magnificent villas and gardens built by emperors before him, became Elagabalus's personal playground. He reportedly filled it with unusual and expensive animals, not just for sacrifice or display, but for companionship and amusement. Imagine stumbling upon a herd of elephants wandering through a mosaic-lined corridor, or spotting a collection of lions lounging in what used to be a formal reception room. You might hear the squawk of exotic birds echoing through the halls, a far cry from the familiar cooing of Roman doves. Historians still argue about the exact species, but the sheer variety suggests a menagerie more fitting for a circus than a dignified imperial residence. Was he collecting these creatures for scientific curiosity, or simply because he could, a manifestation of boundless, childish caprice? His penchant for the absurd manifested in other ways within the palace. He was known for his elaborate pranks, many of which occurred within these very walls. One famous story tells of him inviting guests to sleep in rooms where wild animals, again, reportedly harmless but certainly startling, were released after the guests had fallen asleep. Imagine waking up to find a large, hairy creature sniffing your toes in the pre-dawn gloom. You might let out a yelp, quickly followed by the emperor's delighted chortles from down the hall. Another tale describes him rigging ceiling panels to drop massive amounts of rose petals on unsuspecting diners, sometimes to the point of suffocation. You can almost feel the soft, fragrant avalanche descending, initially pleasant, then quickly becoming terrifying as the pile grows higher. The interior decor itself was a testament to his lavish taste and disregard for Roman austerity. While Roman villas certainly valued beauty, Elagabalus took it to another level. His baths were said to be filled with scented wines instead of water, and he reportedly had entire pools filled with costly spices. Imagine the sticky, aromatic residue left behind after a casual dip. He adorned the palace with an unprecedented amount of gold and jewels, often in garish and unconventional displays. You might find yourself squinting against the glare of a buyer, gem-encrusted wall, wondering if anyone actually lives like this. These Palatine Hill antics were more than just personal quirks. They were symbolic. They demonstrated his absolute power, his ability to defy convention, and his sheer, boundless contempt for the norms of Roman society. The palace, once a symbol of sober imperial authority, became a mirror reflecting the bewildering and often unsettling character of its young ruler. You can almost feel the oppressive weight of chaotic luxury, a sense that anything could happen at any moment within these walls, making even a quiet stroll through the imperial gardens an unnerving experience. After the chaotic spectacles within the imperial palace, you might seek a moment of quiet contemplation, perhaps a visit to the Roman baths. Yet, even in this seemingly mundane aspect of daily life, Elagabalus managed to inject his unique brand of extravagance and unconventionality. You are now entering a Roman bathhouse, typically a place of public gathering, gossip, and communal hygiene, only to find it transformed by the emperor's peculiar preferences. Roman baths were usually functional and grand, with various pools of differing temperatures: the frigidarium, cold; tepidarium, lukewarm; and caldarium, hot. They were for cleanliness, exercise, and socializing. But Elagabalus, always one to elevate the ordinary into the absurd, had his own ideas. He reportedly preferred to bathe in water scented with costly saffron and other exotic perfumes. Imagine stepping into a bath where the water isn't just warm and clean, but also a vibrant yellow-orange and smells overwhelmingly of spices. You might find yourself wondering if you're supposed to bathe or season yourself. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine act of luxury or a deliberately wasteful display of imperial power, a way to show that he literally had money to burn, or rather to soak in. But it wasn't just scented water. Accounts suggest he would sometimes have his baths filled with wine, a scandalous waste of a precious commodity in the ancient world. You can almost picture the slaves meticulously pouring amphora after amphora of vintage Falernian into the imperial tub, while outside, common Romans might be struggling to find enough clean drinking water. This wasn't merely indulgence. It was a profound insult to Roman practicality and frugality. You might hear a grizzled veteran grumble under his breath about bathing in what could be cheering a legion. His personal hygiene practices were equally unconventional for a Roman man. While Roman men were generally clean-shaven and wore simple hairstyles, Elagabalus was known for his elaborate cosmetic routines. He would wear makeup, rouge his cheeks, and pluck his body hair, which was seen as effeminate and un-Roman. Imagine encountering the emperor, fresh from his perfumed bath, his face painted and his eyebrows plucked, a stark contrast to the stern masculine ideals of previous rulers. You might find yourself blinking, trying to reconcile this image with the traditional statues of Roman emperors. Furthermore, he would reportedly bring his male lovers, such as Heracles, to the public baths with him, engaging in open displays of affection that further scandalized the traditional Roman elite. Roman baths were segregated by gender, or had specific times for men and women, and such public displays were deeply offensive to Roman sensibilities. You can almost feel the uncomfortable stares, the quick averting of eyes, as the emperor flouted yet another social convention in plain sight. These baths and hygiene practices weren't just private eccentricities. They were public performances, constantly reminding Rome that their emperor was entirely unlike any who had come before him, further eroding his already fragile legitimacy in the eyes of his subjects. Asterisk, you've seen Elagabalus's lavish banquets and peculiar bathing habits. Now prepare to witness how he brought his flamboyant sense of style to the very public face of the Roman Empire. Imperial fashion and dress. In a society that valued tradition and a clear visual hierarchy, Elagabalus delighted in utterly subverting it, turning his personal wardrobe into another stage for his bewildering reign. Roman emperors typically adhered to a relatively conservative dress code: the senatorial toga for formal occasions, military attire when addressing the legions, and simpler tunics for everyday wear. The color purple was reserved for imperial use, a symbol of power and authority. But Elagabalus found these traditions stifling. He routinely ignored them, opting instead for the elaborate, flowing silk robes of his Syrian homeland. Imagine him attending a formal Senate meeting, not in a crisp white toga, but in shimmering, multicolored silks, perhaps even embroidered with gold thread. You might hear the faint rustle of fabric as he moves, a sound utterly alien to the solemn halls of Roman power. His choice of fabrics was scandalous. Silk was an incredibly expensive import from the East, usually reserved for the most luxurious private garments, not for constant public display. especially by an emperor. By wearing it daily, Elagabalus was not only demonstrating immense wealth, but also a blatant disregard for Roman austerity. He also adorned his clothes with an excessive amount of jewels, often in garish and unconventional patterns. Imagine the glitter of precious stones catching the Roman sun as he parades through the forum, looking more like a deity from a distant land than a sober Roman leader. You might see a few traditionalists squinting, as if the very sight offended their eyes. Even more shocking was his tendency to dress in women's attire. He would famously don the purple robes and veils traditionally worn by empresses, openly presenting himself in a way that challenged the deeply ingrained Roman notions of masculinity and imperial dignity. He would wear makeup, rouge his cheeks, and pluck his body hair, further blurring the lines between male and female presentation. Imagine a grizzled legionary, fresh from campaigning on the frontier, trying to salute an emperor who looks suspiciously like his own wife, albeit a very expensively dressed one. You might hear a muffled cough, quickly disguised as a clearing of the throat. Historians still argue whether this was genuine gender nonconformity, a calculated act of provocation, or simply the unchecked whim of a spoiled young man with unlimited power. Was he expressing an authentic part of himself, or deliberately mocking Roman values? Whatever the motivation, his unconventional fashion and dress choices were not merely personal quirks. They were powerful visual statements that constantly reminded the Roman elite and common citizens alike that their emperor was different, alien, and fundamentally disrespectful of the traditions that held their society together. These sartorial choices contributed significantly to the growing unease and eventual downfall of Elagabalus, proving that sometimes clothes really do make the man, or at least define the peculiar reign. As Elagabalus continued his reign of eccentricity, shocking Rome with his religion, personal life, and fashion, a far more critical audience was growing increasingly restless: the Roman military. You now find yourself among the hardened legions, the very backbone of the empire, whose loyalty was ultimately the only thing that kept an emperor on his throne. And their patience with Elagabalus was wearing thin. The legions, especially those stationed close to Rome, were a pragmatic bunch. They cared about their pay, their bonuses, the donativum, their prestige, and the stability of the empire. Elagabalus initially had promised them much, and his ascension was, after all, due to their support. But his subsequent behavior began to alienate them profoundly. They watched his bizarre rituals with a mixture of confusion and contempt. The idea of their emperor, the imperator, dressing in silk gowns and worshipping a black stone instead of leading them in drills or campaigning, was deeply unsettling. You might hear a gruff centurion muttering, "He looks like a Vestal virgin, not a commander." His lavish spending, while sometimes benefiting the populace with coin tosses, was seen by the military as wasteful. They understood that the empire's coffers funded their legions, and Elagabalus's extravagant parties and peculiar projects seemed to drain resources that could otherwise go to their pay or equipment. They valued military discipline and traditional Roman virtues, and Elagabalus embodied none of them. His effeminate dress, his rumored relationships with male lovers, and his general lack of seriousness in imperial duties were a profound affront to the martial culture of the legions. Imagine a grizzled veteran, scarred from countless campaigns, watching his emperor dance in a bejeweled silk robe during a religious ceremony. The disconnect would have been jarring, almost laughable, if it weren't so serious. Furthermore, Elagabalus often neglected his military duties. He spent little time with the legions, didn't lead campaigns, and seemed more interested in his religious rites and personal pleasures than in the defense of the empire. This created a dangerous vacuum, a sense of disengagement from the very forces that protected his throne. Historians still argue whether his neglect of the military was born of disinterest, incompetence, or a deliberate attempt to assert a different kind of imperial power, one based on religious, rather than martial authority? Was he simply bad at being a general, or was he trying to redefine what it meant to be an emperor? The unrest among the military wasn't uniform. Some units, particularly those initially loyal to him from Emesa, might have maintained their support for longer. But the general sentiment, especially among the Praetorian Guard in Rome, began to shift decisively. The legions were the kingmakers, and if the current king was proving himself utterly unfit, they would eventually look for another. You can almost feel the simmering discontent in the barracks, the low rumble of dissatisfaction that would soon turn into a roar, signaling the end of Elagabalus's bizarre reign. Asterisk. You've just witnessed the simmering discontent among the general legions. But the real power brokers, the ones who could make or break an emperor in Rome, were the Praetorian Guard. You now find yourself within their barracks, a powerful, elite force stationed just outside the city. And their mood, as you'll quickly discern, was rapidly shifting from uneasy tolerance to outright hostility towards Elagabalus. The Praetorian Guard was more than just the emperor's bodyguard. They were kingmakers. Their loyalty was bought, not given, and their expectations were clear. A stable emperor who understood Roman traditions, honored the military, and, crucially, paid them well. Elagabalus failed on almost all counts. His constant religious innovations and public displays of perceived effeminacy were deeply offensive to these hardened soldiers. Imagine a burly Praetorian, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, listening to whispers about the emperor dressing in women's silks or sacrificing doves to a black rock. You might hear him let out a low, disgusted grunt initially. Their loyalty was secured by the immense donativum, bonus payment, they received upon Elagabalus's ascension, largely orchestrated by his grandmother, Julia Mesa. But money, while important, could only buy so much patience. As the scandals mounted, and as Elagabalus continued to prioritize his obscure cult and personal pleasures over effective governance or military matters, the Guard's resolve began to waver. They saw him as weak, undignified, and a threat to the stability of the empire, which, by extension, was a threat to their own privileged position. Julia Mesa, ever the astute political operator, recognized the growing danger. She knew that if the Praetorians turned against Elagabalus, his reign would be over swiftly and violently. She began to strategize, seeking a way to protect her family's dynastic power, even if it meant sacrificing her increasingly erratic grandson. Her attention turned to her other grandson, Elagabalus's cousin, Severus Alexander. He was everything Elagabalus was not. Traditionally Roman, serious, well-behaved, and, crucially, popular with the military. Misa began subtly promoting Alexander, presenting him as a more suitable heir, a counterbalance to Elagabalus's excesses. This created a dangerous internal struggle within the imperial household, playing out right under the Praetorians' noses. Historians still argue whether Misa genuinely loved Alexander more, or if she was simply making a cold, calculated political move to preserve the Severan dynasty. Was she acting out of familial affection or sheer political pragmatism? You might observe a Praetorian captain, his gaze shrewd, noticing the subtle shifts in favor and patronage within the palace, understanding that a change was in the air. The Praetorian Guard, whose mixed loyalties were now increasingly leaning towards Alexander, was becoming a ticking time bomb for Elagabalus. Their discontent was not just a grievance. It was a prelude to the inevitable. You've seen the Praetorian Guard's loyalty waver, and now you're about to witness another arena where Elagabalus's eccentricities played out: the public games. In Rome, these spectacles, chariot races, gladiatorial contests, theatrical performances were essential for maintaining public favor. Emperors were expected to provide lavish entertainment, known as panem et circenses, bread and circuses, to keep the populace happy and distracted. But Elagabalus naturally found a way to make even these traditional events peculiar. He often presided over the games in his signature flamboyant attire, wearing silk robes and elaborate jewelry, a stark contrast to the more somber, dignified dress of previous emperors. Imagine the Roman crowds, accustomed to seeing their leader in a toga or military uniform, now squinting as a shimmering, bejeweled figure takes his seat in the imperial box. You might hear a confused murmur spread through the Colosseum, a few whispers of, "Is that ... the Empress?" before someone corrects them. Elagabalus wasn't content with merely watching. He frequently participated in the games, not as a respected athlete, but as a showman, often in ways that further diminished imperial dignity. He famously drove chariots in the Circus Maximus, not just in practice, but sometimes in actual races. While Roman aristocrats occasionally engaged in such activities privately, an emperor doing so publicly was seen as highly undignified, almost akin to a modern head of state joining a reality TV show. Imagine the sight. The Emperor of Rome, draped in purple and gold, whipping a team of horses around the track, possibly even falling out of his chariot. You might hear the crowd gasp, not in awe, but in horrified embarrassment for their ruler. His fascination with the unusual extended to the types of spectacles he presented. He allegedly staged chariot races with teams of female charioteers, a highly unconventional move for the male-dominated sport. He reportedly introduced exotic animals that had never been seen in Rome, though some accounts suggest he used them more for pranks, like the palace animals, than for traditional hunting spectacles. Historians still argue whether his intention was to innovate and refresh the games, or simply to shock and provoke. Was he a performance artist before his time, or just a boy who loved novelty? Moreover, his generosity during these games was as erratic as everything else. He would sometimes throw vast sums of gold and silver coins into the crowd, leading to chaotic scrambles and injuries. Other times, he would throw harmless objects like sponges or stones, delighting in the confusion. You can almost feel the surge of the crowd, alternately eager for a windfall and wary of a prank, their expectations constantly thwarted by his unpredictable whims. These public games, meant to solidify his connection with the Roman people, often had the opposite effect. They reinforced his image as an erratic, undignified ruler, alienating the populace and contributing to the widespread belief that Rome needed a different kind of emperor. Asterisk, you've witnessed Elagabalus's bizarre public spectacles. Now let's explore another realm where his eccentricities shone, the imperial table. You are now being given a rare glimpse into the emperor's culinary preferences and prohibitions, revealing a side of his reign that was as peculiar as it was extravagant. This wasn't just about lavish feasts. It was about the food and drink that reflected his unusual worldview and boundless, self-indulgence. While we've already touched on his infamous feasts featuring flamingo tongues and parrot brains, it's worth delving deeper into the sheer absurdity of his everyday diet. Elagabalus reportedly disdained common Roman fare. He sought out the most expensive, rarest ingredients from across the vast empire, often at immense cost and effort. Imagine his cooks scrambling to source fresh fish from distant seas or exotic fruits from lands far away, all to satisfy the whim of a teenage emperor. You might even hear the quiet grumbling of the palace quartermasters trying to balance the imperial budget against the emperor's insatiable appetite for novelty. Historians still argue whether his food choices were genuinely based on taste, a display of wealth, or a deliberate rejection of Roman culinary norms. Was he a true gourmand or just a provocateur with a very expensive pantry? His drink preferences were equally extravagant. While wine was a staple in Roman society, Elagabalus often had his wine flavored with costly perfumes or spices, or even, as mentioned before, bathed in it. He preferred wines that were exceptionally rare or old, imported from specific vineyards or regions known for their exclusivity. Imagine the headache of a Roman sommelier trying to satisfy such precise and often ridiculous demands. He was also known to consume vast quantities of aphrodisiacs, which were then believed to enhance physical pleasure and vigor. You might quietly wonder if these were just for him, or if he encouraged his court to partake as well, leading to some very lively and potentially awkward imperial gatherings thought beyond the luxurious. There was also a fascinating element of the absurd. He reportedly fed his horses with foreign dates and his dogs with goose livers, delicacies usually reserved for human consumption. This wasn't just about feeding animals. It was about demonstrating his power to invert the natural order, to treat the ordinary as extraordinary, and the extraordinary as commonplace. You can almost see a prized Romang hound, looking utterly bewildered as it's presented with a plate of foie gras. This obsession with unique food and drink, while seemingly trivial, had a deeper impact. It further highlighted his detachment from the realities of everyday Roman life and the struggles of his subjects. While he feasted on exotic delicacies, many Romans struggled to secure their daily bread. This blatant display of excess contributed to the growing perception of him as an emperor who was not only strange but also profoundly out of touch with his people, further eroding his already fragile popularity. You've just witnessed the lavish, often ridiculous, culinary habits of Elagabalus. But as you observe his reign, you begin to see that such boundless extravagance always comes at a cost. The price of power under Elagabalus was staggering, and the financial strain of his excesses began to show, impacting the very foundations of the Roman Empire. Imagine the imperial treasury, a vast repository meant to fund legions, build roads, maintain infrastructure, and manage the sprawling bureaucracy of the empire. Under Elagabalus, this treasury became a seemingly bottomless pit into which vast sums were poured to satisfy his every whim. His daily sacrifices of hundreds of animals, his lavish banquets featuring exotic ingredients from across the globe, his personal wardrobe of impossibly expensive silks and jewels, and his constant stream of gifts to his favorites. All these expenses were astronomical. You might hear the quiet groans of the imperial accountants, their abacus beads clattering furiously as they tried to make sense of the outgoing funds. Beyond his personal consumption, his habit of scattering gold and silver coins among the populace, while popular in the short term, was a major drain on resources. This wasn't a sustainable economic policy. It was impulsive generosity that severely depleted the imperial coffers. He also granted immense wealth and high positions to his favored lovers and courtiers, further diverting funds and resources from more essential state functions. Imagine a once respected senator watching vast sums of state money being handed over to a charioteer or a dancer. The outrage would have been palpable. This financial profligacy had immediate and negative consequences. The value of Roman coinage began to decline as the mint struggled to keep up with his spending, likely reducing the silver content to produce more coins. This led to inflation, making everyday goods more expensive for common Romans and reducing the real value of soldiers' pay. You might notice the market vendors grumbling about rising prices, and the legionaries looking suspiciously at their coins, feeling them grow lighter. Historians still argue about the precise extent of the monetary debasement under Elagabalus, but the overall trend was clear. His spending habits were unsustainable. Was he simply ignorant of economic principles, or did he genuinely not care about the long-term financial health of the empire? The empire's infrastructure likely suffered as well. Funds that might have gone to repairing roads, maintaining aqueducts, or building public works were instead funneled into personal extravagance. This contributed to a general sense of decline and mismanagement, further eroding public trust in his leadership. The lavishness of Elagabalus's court, far from demonstrating prosperity, became a glaring symbol of a deeper malaise, a reckless disregard for the financial stability of the empire. You can almost feel the quiet hum of financial anxiety spreading through the city, a tangible weight borne by merchants and common citizens alike, as they struggled to adapt to the mounting cost of their emperor's endless caprices. The mounting financial strain and public scandals inevitably led to heightened tension within the very heart of the imperial family itself. You are now observing the complex and often venomous dynamics playing out among Elagabalus, his grandmother Julia Misa, and his mother Julia Soemius. This was not a harmonious household. It was a hotbed of ambition, manipulation, and increasingly, desperation. Julia Misa, the formidable matriarch who had orchestrated Elagabalus's rise to power, watched her grandson's increasingly erratic behavior with growing alarm. She had put him on the throne to secure her family's dynasty, and he was quickly jeopardizing everything. His public cross-dressing, his scandalous marriages, his bizarre religious cult, all of it was eroding his legitimacy and, by extension, the family's hold on power. You can almost see her, a woman of steely resolve, pacing the marble floors of her private chambers, her mind racing, devising a contingency plan. She had made one emperor. She could make another. Julia Soemius, Elagabalus's mother, was often seen as less politically astute than Misa, more inclined to indulge her son's whims. While she initially supported his religious reforms and defended his unconventional lifestyle, even she must have felt the increasing pressure from the Roman elite and the military. She was caught between her son's unpredictable desires and her mother's pragmatic ambition. Imagine the hushed, tense arguments behind closed doors, the clash of wills between mother and daughter, all centered around the increasingly unmanageable young emperor. You might even hear the raised voices, quickly suppressed, as a servant passes by. The central figure in this familial intrigue, however, became Severus Alexander, Elagabalus's cousin and Misa's other grandson. Misa, realizing Elagabalus was a liability, began to strategically promote Alexander as a more suitable heir. He was a quiet, scholarly boy, traditionally Roman in his manners, and crucially, he was popular with the Praetorian Guard, who were thoroughly fed up with Elagabalus. She convinced Elagabalus to adopt Alexander and name him Caesar, or heir apparent, ostensibly to lighten his own workload and secure the succession. Elagabalus, perhaps initially flattered or perhaps just naive, agreed. But it didn't take long for him to realize his mistake. As Alexander's popularity grew, and as the Praetorians began to openly favor the younger, more Roman-minded boy, Elagabalus became consumed by jealousy. He tried to undermine Alexander, removing his tutors and even attempting to have him assassinated. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus genuinely believed he could regain control, or if he was simply lashing out in a fit of petulance. Was he acting out of fear, or pure spite? You can almost feel the chill in the air as the two cousins, once seemingly cordial, became bitter rivals, their lives entangled in a deadly game of imperial succession. The stage was set for a dramatic, inevitable showdown, with the fate of Rome hanging in the balance. You've just witnessed the escalating tension within the imperial family, with Julia Misa subtly, yet determinedly, positioning Severus Alexander as the preferred successor. Now, you'll observe the strategic rise of Severus Alexander himself, a young man carefully groomed to be everything Elagabalus was not, the antithesis of the controversial emperor, a beacon of traditional Roman values. Alexander was Elagabalus's cousin, around 10 years his junior, and a far more conventional figure. Where Elagabalus was flamboyant and obsessed with his Eastern cult, Alexander was quiet, serious, and reportedly devoted to traditional Roman studies and virtues. He was everything the disgruntled Senate and the weary Praetorian Guard longed for in an emperor. Julia Massa, recognizing this profound difference, began to actively promote him. She ensured he received a traditional Roman education, complete, with stoic tutors and lessons in rhetoric, far removed from Elagabalus's exotic curriculum. Imagine a young Alexander diligently practicing his Latin declensions while his cousin was reportedly bathing in perfumed wine. Mace's plan was simple, yet brilliant, to create a stark contrast. She arranged for Alexander to be seen in public, performing traditional Roman duties, attending Senate meetings, and engaging with the military in a solemn, respectful manner. She even had him wear the traditional Roman toga, a subtle but powerful visual statement against Elagabalus's silks. You might hear the murmurs of approval from the crowds as Alexander, modest and unassuming, makes a public appearance, a stark relief from the usual imperial spectacle. Her ultimate move was to convince Elagabalus to adopt Alexander as his son, and name him Caesar, heir apparent, and grant him the title Princeps Juventutis, leader of the youth. This was presented to Elagabalus as a way to secure the Severan dynasty and share the burdens of empire. Elagabalus, perhaps blinded by his own self-absorption or genuinely believing it would stabilize his rule, agreed. This act effectively created a rival center of power within the imperial family, sanctioned by the emperor himself. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus was truly tricked into this, or if he possessed a desperate hope that Alexander's popularity would somehow rub off on him. Was he naive or simply overwhelmed and grasping at straws? As Alexander's star rose, so too did the Praetorian Guard's open admiration for him. They saw in him the Roman emperor they craved, disciplined, respectful of tradition, and seemingly more interested in military matters than in foreign gods. The soldiers would cheer Alexander's name, openly showing their preference. This adulation, of course, fueled Elagabalus's jealousy and paranoia, leading to desperate attempts to undermine his cousin. But it was too late. The stage had been set, and Alexander, groomed by his astute grandmother, was ready to step into the imperial spotlight, ready to usher in a very different kind of reign for Rome. Asterisk, you've just witnessed the escalating tension within the imperial family, with Julia Misa subtly, yet determinedly, positioning Severus Alexander as the preferred successor. Now, you'll observe the strategic rise of Severus Alexander himself, a young man carefully groomed to be everything Elagabalus was not, the antithesis of the controversial emperor, a beacon of traditional Roman values. Alexander was Elagabalus's cousin, around 10 years his junior, and a far more conventional figure. Where Elagabalus was flamboyant and obsessed with his Eastern cult, Alexander was quiet, serious, and reportedly devoted to traditional Roman studies and virtues. He was everything the disgruntled Senate and the weary Praetorian Guard longed for in an emperor. Julia Massa, recognizing this profound difference, began to actively promote him. She ensured he received a traditional Roman education, complete, with stoic tutors and lessons in rhetoric, far removed from Elagabalus's exotic curriculum. Imagine a young Alexander diligently practicing his Latin declensions while his cousin was reportedly bathing in perfumed wine. Mace's plan was simple, yet brilliant, to create a stark contrast. She arranged for Alexander to be seen in public, performing traditional Roman duties, attending Senate meetings, and engaging with the military in a solemn, respectful manner. She even had him wear the traditional Roman toga, a subtle but powerful visual statement against Elagabalus's silks. You might hear the murmurs of approval from the crowds as Alexander, modest and unassuming, makes a public appearance, a stark relief from the usual imperial spectacle. Her ultimate move was to convince Elagabalus to adopt Alexander as his son, and name him Caesar, heir apparent, and grant him the title Princeps Juventutis, leader of the youth. This was presented to Elagabalus as a way to secure the Severan dynasty and share the burdens of empire. Elagabalus, perhaps blinded by his own self-absorption or genuinely believing it would stabilize his rule, agreed. This act effectively created a rival center of power within the imperial family, sanctioned by the emperor himself. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus was truly tricked into this, or if he possessed a desperate hope that Alexander's popularity would somehow rub off on him. Was he naive, or simply overwhelmed and grasping at straws? As Alexander's star rose, so too did the Praetorian Guard's open admiration for him. They saw in him the Roman emperor they craved, disciplined, respectful of tradition, and seemingly more interested in military matters than in foreign gods. The soldiers would cheer Alexander's name, openly showing their preference. This adulation, of course, fueled Elagabalus's jealousy and paranoia, leading to desperate attempts to undermine his cousin. But it was too late. The stage had been set, and Alexander, groomed by his astute grandmother, was ready to step into the imperial spotlight, ready to usher in a very different kind of reign for Rome. The ascent of Severus Alexander, carefully orchestrated by Julia Maesa, naturally ignited the deep-seated jealousy and paranoia of Elagabalus. You now observe the imperial palace as it transforms from a scene of eccentric luxury into a crucible of deadly resentment and desperate attempts to reclaim lost ground. Elagabalus, seeing his own popularity wane and Alexander's star rise, reacted with all the petulance and cruelty of a spoiled child who suddenly found his favorite toy being admired by someone else. His first move was to try and undermine Alexander's newfound popularity. He reportedly ordered Alexander's tutors dismissed, fearing their influence and the positive image they projected of his cousin. He even tried to strip Alexander of his titles and privileges, a direct violation of the adoption agreement. Imagine the outrage among the Praetorians and senators who had placed so much hope in Alexander. Their chosen heir was now being arbitrarily attacked by the very emperor who had elevated him. You might hear the murmurs of discontent growing louder, no longer just whispers. But Elagabalus's jealousy escalated far beyond mere political maneuvering. Accounts from ancient historians, while often exaggerated, suggest he made several attempts on Alexander's life. He reportedly sent agents to poison Alexander's food, a common imperial method of dispatching rivals. Imagine Alexander's attendants, suddenly extra vigilant, tasting every dish before it reached the young Caesar. He also tried to arrange accidents, perhaps a rigged chariot race or a hunting mishap. Historians still argue whether these assassination attempts were definite orders from Elagabalus or merely the desperate actions of overzealous courtiers, trying to please their increasingly unstable emperor. Was he truly a cold-blooded killer, or just a deeply insecure young man lashing out? This internal conflict within the imperial family created a volatile atmosphere in Rome. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty had decisively shifted to Alexander, grew increasingly agitated by Elagabalus's machinations. They saw Alexander as their legitimate choice, and any threat to him was a direct affront to their power and influence. Julia Maesa, the grand architect of this dynastic gamble, must have been in a constant state of anxiety, working tirelessly behind the scenes to protect Alexander and keep the family's ultimate goal-maintaining Severan rule intact. You can almost feel the tension radiating from the palace, a palpable sense of impending doom hanging over the frivolous court. Elagabalus's jealousy and his desperate attempts to sabotage Alexander only served to hasten his own downfall. Each failed plot, each petty act of sabotage, only solidified Alexander's position as the favored alternative and further alienated the powerful forces that had put Elagabalus on the throne. The image of the unpredictable, absurd emperor was now overlaid with that of a dangerously envious and cruel one, pushing Rome ever closer to a decisive, violent resolution. You can almost taste the bitter tang of rivalry in the air, a sure sign that this peculiar chapter in Roman history was drawing to a swift, dramatic close. Asterisk. As Elagabalus's jealousy of Alexander spiraled, you now find yourself observing a subtle, yet significant shift in the atmosphere of Rome. The whispers of discontent, once confined to senatorial villas and praetorian barracks, began to spread like wildfire through the taverns, the bathhouses, and the crowded marketplaces. This was the true genesis of whispers of sedition, the quiet but pervasive spread of anti-imperial sentiment among the common people. The Roman populace, while often distracted by bread and circuses, was not entirely oblivious to the emperor's behavior. They had tolerated, perhaps even been amused by, his initial eccentricities. But his continuous disregard for tradition, his scandalous personal life, his outrageous spending habits that led to inflation, and now his perceived cruelty towards the popular Alexander, began to wear thin their patience. You might hear a baker grumbling about the price of grain while discussing the emperor's latest lavish feast, or a washerwoman tutting over the rumors of Alexander's treatment. The common person, unlike the elite, often felt the tangible impact of imperial mismanagement. The stories of Elagabalus's bizarre rituals, his cross-dressing, and his effeminate behavior, once subjects of horrified fascination, now became points of open mockery. Caricatures of the emperor might appear scrawled on walls, quickly erased but leaving their message. Jokes, once suppressed, might now be told with a knowing wink and a quieter, but more defiant chuckle. Remember that attempted ban on laughter? It backfired spectacularly. Now, every suppressed laugh became a tiny act of rebellion. Historians still argue about the true extent of popular opinion, but it's clear that Elagabalus had lost the public's respect, a vital component for any Roman emperor, no matter how powerful his military. Was the common Roman genuinely offended by his perceived immorality, or simply tired of the chaos and instability he brought? This growing popular dissatisfaction was a crucial factor. While the Praetorian Guard held the swords, the public's widespread disapproval could sap military morale, embolden conspirators, and make any subsequent transition of power seem more legitimate. The urban unrest wasn't an organized revolt, but rather a pervasive sense of fatigue and desire for change. You can almost feel the collective sigh of weariness that seemed to emanate from the bustling streets of Rome, a subtle pressure building against the imperial palace. Julia Maesa and her loyalists undoubtedly monitored this shifting public mood. They knew that an emperor who had lost both the military and the people was living on borrowed time. The whispers of sedition weren't just idle gossip. They were the rumblings of an empire preparing to shake off a ruler it no longer wanted. The stage was now set, not just for a family struggle, but for a swift and definitive end to Elagabalus's reign, driven by a city weary of his endless peculiarities. The mounting discontent, both within the military and among the populace, finally reached a boiling point, leading to the inevitable, plotting his demise. You are now privy to the hushed, anxious conversations and clandestine meetings that took place within the Praetorian barracks, where the decision to remove Elagabalus was no longer a question of if, but when and how. Julia Maesa, the shrewd grandmother, was undoubtedly at the heart of these machinations. She had carefully nurtured Severus Alexander's popularity and watched Elagabalus self-destruct. Her primary goal was to preserve the Severan dynasty, and it became painfully clear that Elagabalus was an existential threat to that ambition. She worked tirelessly to solidify the Praetorian Guard's loyalty to Alexander, ensuring that when the time came, they would act decisively in his favor. Imagine her, a seemingly frail old woman, but with a mind sharper than any Roman sword, orchestrating the downfall of her own grandson with chilling precision. You might even hear the quiet clink of wine cups as conspirators toast to a new, more stable future for Rome. The Praetorian Guard, fed up with Elagabalus's erratic behavior, his insults to their dignity, and his perceived attempts on Alexander's life, were more than willing participants. They saw Alexander as their legitimate choice, a return to the strong, traditional leadership they craved. The constant fear of Elagabalus's unpredictable temper and arbitrary punishments likely fueled their desire for a quick resolution. They were not just soldiers. They were highly organized, politically aware kingmakers, and they had decided their current king was unfit. Historians still argue about the exact sequence of events that led to the final coup. Was it a single, sudden act, or the culmination of weeks of careful planning and subtle provocations? The pretext for the final confrontation was often an attempt by Elagabalus to assert his authority or undermine Alexander, which would then be met with open defiance from the guard. He reportedly tried to force them to acknowledge only him, or perhaps tried another trick to remove Alexander. Each time, the Praetorians, emboldened by Massa's quiet assurances and their own collective resolve, stood firm. This created a perilous standoff, with the power increasingly shifting away from the emperor and towards his own personal guard. You can almost feel the tension in the air, a palpable dread as the inevitable conflict drew closer. The conspirators understood the urgency. Elagabalus's behavior was becoming more unstable, and the longer he remained on the throne, the more damage he could inflict on the empire and on the Severan legacy. The decision was made. The time for patient maneuvering was over. The plots that had been whispered in hushed tones would soon explode into violent action, bringing a swift and brutal end to the most bizarre reign in Roman history. You can almost taste the metallic tang of impending violence, a grim certainty hanging over the imperial capital. Asterisk. The stage was set, the plot simmering, and the clock was ticking for Elagabalus. You are now thrust into the very last days of his reign, a rapid unraveling that saw his authority crumble almost hour by hour. The atmosphere in Rome was thick with a palpable tension, a sense that something monumental and violent was about to occur. Elagabalus, seemingly oblivious to the full extent of the danger, or perhaps simply in denial, continued his erratic behavior. He made a desperate attempt to assert his dwindling authority by demanding that the Praetorian Guard disavow Alexander. He ordered them to assemble, intending to publicly strip Alexander of his titles and reassert his own supreme power. Imagine the Praetorians, stony-faced and armed, receiving this order. You might hear the faint clink of armor as they exchanged grim glances, their resolve hardening. This was the final straw. The Praetorian Guard, who had been meticulously cultivated by Julia Maesa and whose loyalty now firmly lay with Alexander, refused to obey. They insisted that Alexander accompany Elagabalus to the camp, a demand that, in effect, meant they recognized Alexander's authority as equal, if not superior, to the emperor's. This public defiance was a monumental humiliation for Elagabalus, a clear sign that his power was effectively gone. Historians still argue about the precise details of these final confrontations. Was Elagabalus truly surprised by the Praetorians? Defiance, or was he desperately trying to provoke a reaction that would reaffirm his power, no matter how fleeting? As Elagabalus entered the Praetorian camp, accompanied by Alexander, the cheers of the soldiers were overwhelmingly for the younger cousin. Elagabalus, enraged by this blatant show of disloyalty, reportedly tried to punish those who cheered for Alexander. This act of petulance sealed his fate. The Praetorians, who had initially been willing to tolerate a shared rule, now saw his vengeful nature and realized that their own lives, and Alexander's, were at risk if Elagabalus remained alive. You can almost feel the air growing heavy with menace, The excited shouts turning into a low, dangerous rumble. The situation spiraled rapidly out of control. The Praetorians, now in open rebellion against their emperor, moved decisively. They were no longer simply refusing orders. They were asserting their will with force. Elagabalus, frantic and desperate, tried to flee, reportedly hiding in a latrine or attempting to disguise himself. But there was no escape. The very guards who had once elevated him now hunted him down with grim determination. These final hours were a chaotic, terrifying culmination of his brief, tumultuous reign, ending not with a bang but with a desperate, ignominious flight. You can almost hear the pounding footsteps in the palace corridors, the shouts of the Praetorians closing in, signaling the truly grim end to a truly peculiar era. The chase was short, the outcome inevitable. You are now witnessing the dramatic and violent end to Elagabalus's reign, a brutal climax to a period of unprecedented imperial oddity. The Praetorian Guard, whose patience had finally snapped, moved with swift and unforgiving efficiency. Elagabalus, having failed in his desperate attempts to flee or hide, was captured. Ancient accounts, though varying in their graphic details, agree on the core outcome. It was reportedly found by the Praetorians, dragged from his hiding place, and brought before the infuriated soldiers. There, in their camp, the very place where he had been proclaimed emperor just 4 years prior, he met his brutal end. He was assassinated on March 11th, 222 AD, at the age of just 18. Imagine the scene. The young, flamboyant emperor, stripped of his elaborate silks and jewels, facing the grim, unyielding faces of the soldiers who once hailed him. You might hear the metallic clang of weapons, quickly followed by terrified screams. His mother, Julia Soemius, who had indulged many of his whims and likely played a role in some of the more scandalous aspects of his court, also met a swift and bloody end. The Praetorians, recognizing her complicity and perhaps fearing her future influence, did not spare her. They were a force determined to clean house, to eliminate all vestiges of the regime they had grown to despise. You can almost feel the palpable rage emanating from the soldiers, a fury born of frustration and perceived humiliation. The bodies of Elagabalus and Julia Soemius were treated with the utmost contempt, a clear message to anyone who might consider following in their footsteps. Elagabalus's body was dragged through the streets of Rome, paraded before the jeering crowds who had once been subjected to his laughter ban and bizarre spectacles. It was then, in a final act of ultimate degradation, thrown into the Tiber River. This was a deliberate symbolic act, preventing him from receiving a proper burial, denied him entry to the afterlife according to Roman beliefs, ensuring his spiritual condemnation as well as his physical demise. You might even hear the shouts of the Roman populace, a mixture of grim satisfaction and perhaps a lingering sense of shock at the brutality of the scene. Julia Misa, the grandmother who had orchestrated his rise and then his cousin's ascent, survived. Her political acumen and her careful positioning of Severus Alexander ensured her survival, a testament to her ruthless pragmatism. She had achieved her goal. The Severan dynasty was preserved, albeit with a new, more acceptable face on the throne. Historians still argue about the extent of Mace's direct involvement in Elagabalus's assassination. Was she merely a silent enabler, or a direct orchestrator of his death? The abrupt and violent end of Elagabalus served as a stark reminder of the precarious nature of imperial power in Rome, especially for an emperor who dared to defy too many traditions. Asterisk. The violence of Elagabalus's assassination was quickly followed by an equally brutal and symbolic act, his damnatio memoria. You are now observing the systematic erasure of his very existence from Roman history, a chilling testament to the empire's desire to forget its most scandalous emperor. This wasn't merely about removing his name from records. It was an attempt to wipe him from public memory, to pretend he had never even been there. The Senate, now under the more traditional and compliant rule of Severus Alexander, eagerly embraced this opportunity. They decreed a damnatio memoria for Elagabalus. This meant his name was to be physically chiseled off public monuments, inscriptions, and official documents. Imagine a team of stonemasons, hammers and chisels in hand, meticulously chipping away at the names of Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, his official imperial name, from triumphal arches, statues, and dedication plaques. You might hear the rhythmic tap, tap, tap as history was literally undone, leaving behind telltale blank spaces or rough patches where his name once stood. His statues were pulled down and defaced, their heads often removed and replaced with those of more acceptable emperors, or even simply melted down. Images of him on coins were demonetized and recalled, and new coins were minted with the image of Severus Alexander. Imagine the faces of vendors and citizens, suddenly presented with worthless currency, bearing the visage of the disgraced emperor. This wasn't just about disrespect. It was about invalidating his entire reign, declaring it illegitimate. The motivation behind damnatio memoria was clear: to signal a return to traditional Roman values and to distance the new regime of Severus Alexander from the scandalous excesses of his predecessor. It was a powerful political statement, an attempt to restore order and respectability to the imperial office. By erasing Elagabalus, they sought to erase the memory of his bizarre religious practices, his scandalous personal life, and his affronts to Roman dignity. Historians still argue about the true effectiveness of damnatio memoria. While physical traces could be removed, could the memory of such a notorious figure ever truly be forgotten? Did it genuinely erase him from public consciousness, or merely amplify his infamy? This systematic erasure extended to his personal life and cult. The Black Stone of Elagabal, the very symbol of his reign, was reportedly returned to Emesa, its brief, controversial tenure in Rome emphatically over. His lavish temple on the Palatine was likely dismantled or repurposed. The Vestal Virgin he had married was restored to her vows, and his male lovers likely faced severe repercussions. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief from traditional Romans, a sense that the natural order had been restored, even if the scars of Elagabalus's brief, shocking reign would remain. Despite the Roman Senate's best efforts at damnatio memoria, the legacy of absurdity left by Elagabalus proved impossible to fully erase. You are now reflecting on the lasting, albeit peculiar, impact of his brief, chaotic rule on Roman history. His reign, though short, was a truly theatrical spectacle, a period so outlandish that it continues to captivate and perplex historians to this day. Elagabalus's impact wasn't found in military victories or wise laws. Instead, his legacy lies in the sheer, bewildering contrast he presented to traditional Roman imperial rule. He was a walking, talking, silk-robed affront to Roman ideals of masculinity, dignity, and piety. He inadvertently highlighted the fragility of Roman institutions, showing how easily a young, willful emperor could upend centuries of tradition. Imagine the whispers that would continue for generations. Remember that emperor who tried to ban laughter? You might even hear a Roman grandparent tell their grandchild a cautionary tale about the boy who worshipped a rock. His reign became a cautionary tale for future emperors. It served as a stark reminder that while military power was essential, public opinion, senatorial support, and adherence to Roman norms also played crucial roles in maintaining power. Any future emperor considering extreme religious innovation or flamboyant personal conduct would undoubtedly recall the fate of Elagabalus. He became the ultimate example of what not to do if you wanted a long and stable reign. Historians still argue whether his reign was purely a product of his unique personality, or if it reflected deeper anxieties and changes within Roman society, particularly the growing influence of Eastern cults and ideas. Was he an outlier, or a symptom of broader cultural shifts? His story, even as it was officially suppressed, survived in later historical accounts, often embellished and sensationalized, but preserving the core narrative of his extraordinary strangeness. Writers like Cassius Dio and Herodian, who lived through or shortly after his reign, provided vivid, if biased, descriptions of his excesses. These accounts ensured that the memory of the mad emperor would endure, a constant source of fascination, and a testament to the unpredictable nature of absolute power. You can almost feel the enduring shock waves of his reign, ripples that extended far beyond his brief 4 years on the throne. Ultimately, Elagabalus's legacy is one of profound oddity. He was a vivid, unforgettable anomaly in the long line of Roman emperors, a ruler who challenged every convention and left behind a story so bizarre it borders on myth. His reign stands as a powerful, if peculiar, illustration of what happens when boundless power meets unbridled eccentricity, creating a period of Roman history that is truly stranger than fiction. You might find yourself quietly shaking your head, wondering if such a character could ever truly exist again. Asterisk, as you conclude this fascinating journey through the bizarre reign of Elagabalus, you find yourself considering the most enduring question historians debate. Even centuries later, scholars grapple with how to truly interpret his perplexing rule. He remains one of the most controversial and enigmatic figures in Roman history, a continuous source of scholarly discussion and disagreement. Was Elagabalus a genuine religious zealot, deeply devoted to his sun god, simply trying to integrate his beliefs into the Roman pantheon, albeit clumsily? Or was his religious fervor merely a political tool, a cynical attempt to assert absolute power by claiming divine authority? Some historians lean towards the idea that he was a sincere, if misguided, priest-king, whose upbringing in Emesa simply left him ill-equipped for the complexities of Roman governance and culture. They might argue that his attempts to elevate Elagabal were a genuine spiritual mission, misunderstood and demonized by a traditionalist Roman elite. Conversely, many scholars view him as a spoiled, hedonistic, and incredibly immature tyrant, whose actions were driven by personal whim, a desire to shock, and a profound lack of respect for established norms. They highlight his extreme extravagance, his cruel pranks, and his open mockery of Roman traditions as evidence of a narcissistic personality rather than a coherent political or religious agenda. Historians still argue about the reliability of ancient sources. Were they merely exaggerating his flaws to paint a picture of a monstrous emperor, or did they accurately capture the essence of his bewildering reign? You might find yourself weighing the evidence, trying to discern the true nature of this strange figure. The debate also extends to his gender expression. Was Elagabalus an early example of gender fluidity or transgender identity, genuinely feeling himself to be female? Or was his cross-dressing and desire to be called mistress another calculated act of provocation, a way to subvert Roman masculinity and further scandalize his conservative subjects? This is a particularly sensitive area of modern scholarship, with interpretations often reflecting contemporary understandings of gender and identity. Ultimately, Elagabalus forces historians to confront the limits of their sources and the complexities of interpreting ancient figures. His reign challenges neat classifications and reminds us that power, combined with a truly unique personality, can lead to utterly unpredictable outcomes. He remains a figure that resists easy answers, continuing to spark debate and fascination. Among those who delve into the annals of Roman history, you can almost hear the quiet hum of scholarly discourse, an endless pursuit of understanding a reign that truly defies easy explanation. Asterisk, the quiet journey through the peculiar reign of Elagabalus now gently draws to a close. You've walked the bustling, then strangely quiet, streets of ancient Rome, witnessed the clash of cultures, and felt the palpable tension within the imperial palace. As the echoes of ancient whispers and the rustle of silk robes fade, allow your mind to drift. The weighty togas and the scent of exotic incense are now but distant impressions. The controversies of an emperor who tried to ban laughter recede, replaced by the soft hum of stillness. Let the curious tales settle into the quiet corners of your thoughts, like dust motes dancing in the last rays of a setting sun. There is no need for alarm, no need for the clamor of ancient history now. Just a gentle easing, a deepening calm, as the past melts away into the soft present. Feel the quiet envelop you, a blanket of historical tranquility. Rest easy, my friend.